So, folks, today we will discuss quite an interesting topic for me, which is composition API in Angular Ivy, because Ivy have opened the road for some quite interesting patterns, and I really suppose that's the next level of reusability for your application. A couple of words about me. I'm creator for Valor Software, several open source Angular libraries like ngx-bootstrap, was organized in NG Talks IO in 2018, Google Developer Expert, or you can find me as Valorkin everywhere. So we'll start with a problem introduction. Why components became huge? And we should know as a developer that the only persistent thing is change. We do our little shiny components which does one thing perfectly, and then real lives come in and starts to bring changes. Rarely given a time for a second thought, and eventually we have one another null do all component, unfortunately. Reusable components are a potential solution to this issue, but they face approximately the same fate eventually, but with less awareness of the application itself. The only thing which reusable components know is their inputs, their outputs, their behavior. And the worst part, if you need to develop a very similar thing, you end up with copy-pasting all of your code somewhere else. And taming application complexity is just not about Angular itself. Any framework, not necessarily Angular framework, has that issue. There are a lot of ways how you can tame an application complexity, but what's new in Angular world, it's not new in development world in general. So to clearly understand the need of composition approaches, we need to get an overview of existing patterns which we can use, their drawbacks and their positive sides. I want to especially highlight a thank you note for the Vue 3 composition API request for comments, which happened somewhere, I suppose, in 2018, early 2019. And that kind of ideas which was described there, I really like those and tried to apply it as much as I could in Angular world. And eventually, like that was more than a year ago, that got me to some interesting conclusion and patterns I'm currently using in Angular development. So before we go in further, as any approach as a development need, the first thing we should do is to clearly establish our requirements, right? So one of the most important requirements is readable code, right? So you're not working in isolation. Your teammates should be able to help on your code and continue your work. Code should be maintainable. Maintainable is how it's easy to fix or enhance your code. Obviously, small isolated parts is much easier to comprehend and change. Your code should be extendable. Not only your components, of course, should be extendable, but it should be easy to extend the features of your code and add additional or enhance already existing. If all of that sounds familiar to you, that there are pretty solid reason for that, which is called solid. Before going further, we should highlight several code reuse practices. Of course, there are more reuse practices which you may know or may use, but the main of those, which you can see in 90, maybe 5% of the applications, of course, you can take that with a grain of salt, but base classes, services for sure, content projection, named slots, global state management, mixins, high order components, and of course, kind of composition API. As of mixins, a high order component, that's a special topic which we should take a look a bit more, because everything else, most likely you already have seen, tried, or even used. But whatever we do, however we try to avoid to not get in touch with the spaghetti monster, at some point of time, we eventually faith in him in a real life or real code. So the mixins. Mixins is not a new pattern in general, but it became more easily to use it with Angular since Ivy. And what I currently see on the screen is rather mixin factory, which extends the class you have provided. At the bottom, you can see that some component extends with form check, and you can put inside of those brackets additional classes or additional mixins and change those in order to create your base mixin. As of other approaches, like you can use mixin factories, or you can use mixin helper function. Like you can see on this screen, mixture is a mixin helper function, which helps me to join or unite several classes in one and then extend those as a based on mixture component. Of course, mixin has some really good pros and some drawbacks. Code, of course, are code organized by feature, and that's real good. Reduce repetitive code for sure, but has really bad drawbacks. React and Vue was populating for mixins for quite a while, but somewhere like 4 years ago, they started to acknowledge them as harmful, and even added that to the official documentation that mixins is something which you should not use because of name conflicts, implicit properties, dependencies, and so on. High order components is a quite new topic. Unfortunately, that's not the easy thing to do because as you could see from a code sample, at least 2 parts here using thetas. If you will take a look on the const original factory component type dot theta fag, that is access to the factory, which is a private API. And the next slide, you have theta component factory, which is again private. That's nothing completely bad, but again, that means that you are dependent on some kind of private APIs, which could be not the case for some enterprise application developers. As an approach, high order components has a list of do's and don'ts. So what it should not do, should not create properties, should not add explicit dependencies or mutate the original component. The reason for it is why you should use high order components. The main idea of those is that you should be able to use your component in the same way as with high order components and the same way without. It should not block your component to work without high order components. Basically, you're not able to enhance or rather change the behavior of your component. You can rather enhance it in the way that components will not know about it. So those could be applied to one or many components, and that's mostly the things you should know about how do's and don'ts. If you switched about the positive part, of course, code organized by feature, and it heavily reduces repetitive code. On the drawbacks, obviously, not all developers unfortunately following the best practices, and nothing forbids them to create properties. And that will lead to name conflicts same way as did mixins. Implicit properties and implicit dependencies. Unfortunately, because you will not be able to know about that from inside the component. And here we go to the interesting part is for me, the composition structure. Key motivations for Angular Composition API, which is kind API, that we are able to convert most of the drawbacks of existing approaches to the positive parts. How you're able to do explicit properties or dependencies, how you is able to reuse full or partial logic reuse from your services, for example, which you basically could do right now, but in a more explicit way. Of course, code organized by features and reduced boilerplate is one of the most important things, as for me. Component state, should be static. What that means that you don't have observable subject or other things as a properties of your component. So basically, you don't have any async in your HTML. Some say that I'm really care about performance of your applications, and I really do, especially if you develop reusable components. Such thing which is themes not quite affecting performance on a scale could really kill it. So one of the things how you can start an approach, not even API, how you can start approach a composition of your things is how do you split them logically. So whenever you have one component, those components at any given time most likely have many mixed features implemented inside of the one component. And let's think about it and trying to split in logically independent parts, often versus rarely modified parts of your component, model logic versus view logic by removing some many nasty things from your HTML, which perform calculation or expression to the model itself or vice versa, and model versus platform logic. Let's take a look on several examples. That's my favorite one, maybe. This is material checkbox from Angular components, and it's only 500 lines of code. And that's actually one of the simplest components you can find there. And I honestly tried to make these screenshots pretty, but failed miserably, as you can see. But the good thing about it is that that was only an API part. That was only inputs and outputs. As you could guess, it's quite hard to comprehend what is written up there, not only for people who see this first time, but for maintainers too. Because there are a lot of things which they maybe even would love to not even see up there, right? Some parts they could cut off. But in order to start to move in that direction, let's speak about what is like your inputs, outputs, or other bindings are. So inputs and outputs, this is our promise to component consumers. Ideally, this is a clean and documented interface, some kind of a contract between our component and application developer, right? That's something we give outside. Let's try to take a look on this checkbox component under a different angle. We could see there an ID, which is HTML element ID and available for any component. Why not to split it into independent class? Then we can see quite a good thing for accessibility, which is area label attributes. And again, we most likely will ever change this part. Once written, it most likely will be never changed again. It's logically independent and could exist outside of the main component. This part is a web-specific thing. So input checkbox attributes, that's not something specific to material checkbox. That's something where documentation, you could even put a link to, for example, Mozilla documentation about input checkbox. And per folks, it will be able to find more examples or more understanding about what those properties do. Like if they say duplication of a code is a bad thing, replication of documentation sometimes not much better. So this thing, we are not even able, or should not, I would say, change API or names of these properties inputs, because they should be the same, should behave the same as a native input checkbox. As for platform-specific code, as any of you who was developing any kind of component which should integrate with a form, you should know what is control value accessor. This is a code which you will again write once and will never change again. But it will take maybe, it depends on your implementation, up to 30 lines of a code. For a checkbox, that's 10% of the code you see, plus comments, plus something else. And each time you want to change your component, you actually will take a look and you will see you will not be able to skip this part for sure. Why not to split it to independent class? And of course, real API, which we add on top of input checkbox, right? One optional field and a couple of outputs. That's what we really do. That's real, I would say, real API of material checkbox, which exists on top of anything else which already existed in HTML. And of course, the most nasty part, which you'll change most often, that's your properties or bindings to HTML. This is your work table. This is what you change, that's what you align, that's what you should see all the time. And of course, we can unite all of those nasty classes in one thing and be happy about it. Just joking. The other option how we could do that thing, again, using mixing helper function. And what is the difference, you say, between mixings and all the drawbacks you have showed before? The simple convention over configuration that you're mixing classes with static, or I would say synchronous properties, which doesn't have functionality. So even if one of the mixins will override the property of another one, the worst case you will have at compile time that those types of those properties cannot be assigned. That's it. That's some kind of a convention which makes your life easier. And as soon as we have an approach of not bringing functionality in those API classes, API definitions, as an entry point to our split of functionality, we don't bring any implicit dependency. We don't bring any implicit interactions. And it's really easy to use. So, for example, if you wish to develop a couple of components with real similar functionality, but a bit different API, you can mix as much as you want those parts of API, right? Known issues, which as an honest person, I have to mention to you that decorator instance not always works properly as for now, but there are workarounds, and there are, of course, directive hack, which you could see on some screens, but shouldn't worry about that too much because those hacks are used in Angular material. So if you use Angular material, you're already consuming those hacks and they're working fine for you. So that's fine. Before going too much deeper in this concept, we have now our entry point of splitting API by logical parts. Those are features we are planning to provide a functionality. Let's take a look on a couple of, I would say, essential things in order to make those split easier. And one of those is observable lifecycle events. In most cases, each lifecycle method will have a salad of invocations from several features implemented in that component, because they're available only as those methods, and if you need your feature needs some kind of action in that hook, you are limited to that method in your component. With observable lifecycle events, what you can do is wrap it around. You can see in constructor there are these enable hooks, which emulates some kind of a feature which want to listen for the hook itself. There are a couple of interesting parts here that, first of all, you're able to, of course, convert them to promise and simply wait for NGUnit, then do some init function, set up your component properties, then you're able to wait for your after content in, and then again create something or subscribe. Interesting part about the subscribe, you don't even have to now create a not necessary property on your component, which is not a part of your external API, and you are able to use a local variable, and then you can wait for destroy event and just unsubscribe from that local property. Right? So the good thing about it, which I like the most about the view composition and what they have, is this picture, which affected me real deep, and I had a real deep impression about it. So the simple idea of grouping features from spread across the component to some blocks which you're able to see and work with one feature at a time, you don't have to parse through several features in order to get to the one of the methods which are mixed around your component. And observable lifecycle events is one of those things which allows you to flatten feature spaghetti and actually hook in one place to your for a feature thing. So the functional split, which is an interesting topic, and we'll briefly discuss some of the options we have for a functional split per feature. Intentionally have not put any kind of code here because there are two options which we should be able to understand without even any kind of code. First of all is a base class or component itself which implements the behavior, right? Not a big deal. But for example, our autocomplete component in material is 1500 lines of code, which is quite a lot to go through and try to debug or trying to understand in which methods you actually have in your features. Sorry, had some outcomes of the flu last week. And obviously, with these components, it would be really hard to work. Other good options is services or services factory created through injection tokens, which allows you to create parts of like one feature, one service, one API. Sounds good to me. We'll get back to that later. Other topic which I have to mention, which is a real nice thing, which was released about 3 months ago, is NGUPEx component store. What interesting about that in ngx-bootstrap we're using similar approach for the last 3.5 years. The code base only 40 lines of code of RxJS, which allows us to use the same approach as component store. Highly recommend to take a look on it if you will not be able to even go through composition approach. Other thing to mention is ngx-bootstrap, which is a one-to-one implementation or plus minus one-to-one implementation of Vue composition API itself, which I find at some time I found it that's very interesting. But as for now, I do understand that I would love to reduce the learning curve for a new approach as much as I can for new developers. Here we came to feature integrations, which is quite interesting thing because this is the heart of how you unite your model as a properties or parts of the API to actual implementation, for example, provided by services. While Vue option to unite part of the implementation as a pure function looks good for Vue, we have a dependency injection, and we have all of the things for which we love or hate Angular, but they make our application much more configurable and much more dynamic at the runtime. And of course, as any task, there are some implementation requirements I see which is necessary to keep in mind that we should use minimal or zero private Angular API usage, performance, and of course, use case coverage, and something else could be to come. There are several reasons for your feature to provide methods for to a component API surface. One of those is allow users to trigger an action from a component template. In this case, this method should be public and a part of your public API of a component. One of the things which is most annoying for a boilerplate, while you're able to cut the part of the feature into the service, you will still have all of the boilerplate connected to injecting those service usage inside of your methods. While the simple things like bind methods, you're able to do it as a one-liner. Other often use case, which you can see as get set and some kind of private property, is react to a property change from a template or on input, because if on change provides you a way to react on input change, most likely nobody used do check in order to check that property value has changed from template. Most people use setters. And there are, of course, some smaller, maybe even better way in some cases to provide those connections between your property, and some kind of a setter. And again, all of this is around the idea that your feature setup has all necessary in order to make your feature working for this component. Next important thing is react to a change of an input. Whilst that could be a part of the component, having observable lifecycle events makes providing you an option to create actually some side effects inside of your services. Sorry. While you have helper methods for a change, you don't have to write again all of those if, else checks that the simple value changes actually contain the name of your property in order to call a function from a service. Sounds like a lot of repetitive boilerplate, which it is. You could do that with some functions which allow you to compose all of that in one feature initiation part rather than a lot of places. But all of that falls into more generic idea. One more thing last to have better understanding for the next real life examples, I would love to say, is a lot of boilerplates. And the thing which I don't really like is your async pipe and all related to it in your template, because HTML structure DOM at any given point of time is static, and we're trying to bring some kind of async behavior inside of it, right? And as soon as we try to connect fetching data from the backend or ngx selector, which exist in async way, and we're trying to connect those to static properties which exist in HTML or in our component, we have to provide a lot of boilerplate code again, or use some helper functions which allows us to work with async behavior inside of the templates, which doesn't sound cool to me. So small helper methods could do a nice trick. But if we'll take a look on some more real life example, when we have an ID property which was changed from template or from the input, and we need to react on that part, that means that you will be able to connect and simply bind without any kind of additional behavior or without additional boilerplate, and you're able to register all of your necessary things for your feature behavior in one place. Real fast, we'll wrapping out. As a sample, chain a dropdown for a city selection, which is in most cases will look like this. Whenever you have around 9 properties, from 3 will be async and 3 methods, which again will be async. With View Composition API, it will look, I would say, a bit better because it's static and has computed properties on the board. While in Composition API for Angular, it will look even a bit simpler because your component extends the mixture of parts of the API on one hand, and on the other hand, you're able to set up those things in one place in 3 lines of code. Underneath the hood, that will look like that as soon as counter name your input value changes, you're able to trigger the fetching by name and bind that to some property, and all of that will be static at any given point of time. Really excited about that thing. I was planning to do even more about it this year, but 2020 was nice to all of us, I suppose, so plans have changed a bit. And to sum up this rush topic, because as you could understand, it's much bigger than 30 minutes could cover. Even if you are gonna try the thing, you should realize that you should not rush to use all the things. I prefer an approach when you make it work and make it pretty and do one step at a time. Think about how this approach could change Angular CDK or your UI kit libraries or your reusable components, and how this change the way you test your components, because you're able to use part of the feature from a component, and that feature doesn't even know about the Angular itself. So that will work faster and will be much easier to test. Hopefully you enjoyed this small bit of a presentation. As a final word, which I have a question. Yeah, that's work in progress. First thing, what I'm doing right now is I'm applying the thing to ngx-bootstrap, and as soon as it will be beta tested and ready for mass production, it will be released as a separate library, which will be consumed. As a reference list, you will be able to find the link to libraries and documents I was mentioning on the time of this presentation. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully you enjoyed it.